Hi, it's Keith from the Evangelical Free Church, Stony Stratford, and we're continuing our series of short talks in the Gospel of Luke. Today we're looking at Luke chapter 2, verses 41 to 52. Just recently, I was sorting through some old photographs, and it's interesting because it took me back to the first years of being married to Tracy, and it brings back a lot of very happy memories. And the interesting thing we see here is that in verse 51, Mary kept a record. Very much echoes what we read earlier. She'd remembered these events and maybe she passed them on to Luke or to someone close to Luke. And this event is the keeping of the Passover. It's interesting to note that Joseph and Mary, you probably expect this, are quite devout. They keep the law, and the Passover was a key festival. But there was one trip that particularly stood out. It's an interesting insight into Jesus's childhood. And it's when they go up, and we read, verse 43, after the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it, thinking that he was in their company. They travelled for a day, then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. With the kind of extended families, it's quite likely that Jesus could have mixed with the other families and children. It's rather interesting, isn't it? It shows Jesus having a normal childhood, as it were. But he's missing. And they go looking for him. They go back to Jerusalem. And where do they find him? Well, they find him in the temple. But this is no childish prank. Just listen to this. He was sitting in the sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. It's clear that Jesus has a real grasp of the scriptures. He's basically sort of sitting there among the top theologians of the day. And his parents are astonished at this. And they ask a very natural question. Son, verse 48, Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Well, if that was a natural question, they get an astonishing answer. Jesus basically says, this is where you would expect to find me. Verse 49, why were you searching for me, he asked. Didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house? It's interesting, isn't it? They don't get it. They don't understand it. You can imagine Mary perhaps explaining this to Luke and saying, well, I didn't get it at the time, but I get it now. It's an interesting insight into his childhood, but there's something more than this, isn't there? Because the passage doesn't stop there. Verse 51 is important. Then he, that's Jesus, went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, in favour with God and men. Jesus continued to grow spiritually. And basically the impression we're given in these verses is that he pleases God in every way. In the events that we don't even have recorded in Scripture or from his childhood. It's an interesting one, isn't it? We see throughout his ministry that Jesus in some way had a relationship with the temple. He really saw himself in some ways as linked to it. Very much his spiritual home when it was used in the right way. Well, how does that relate to us today? In 1 Peter chapter 2, we read this. This is verse 4 and 5. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by men but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Just as Christ associated himself with the temple, literally where the Jews believed they could meet God, or where God sort of touched the human world and experience. Jesus is our temple. And like him, we are being built into, as it says here, a spiritual house. It's using a lot of Old Testament imagery here. It's actually echoing, and Peter will go on to actually mention some Old Testament psalms, which he believes are prophecy, talking about Christ being a living stone, a precious cornerstone. In other words, the foundation stone. And we're being built into that spiritual house. How can we do that when we're sinful people who do our own thing? Only by turning to Jesus Christ. It mentions, doesn't it, that we are offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God. On our own merit? No. Only through Jesus Christ and his work on the cross. Thank you again for listening.